I couldn't say on a bus that I support Ukraine. Of course I couldn't. In fact, all these years I walked around, looked around, and waited for someone to come after me. The sound of steps on the staircase always made my heart race. But with any kind of escalation, when someone threatened me, saying, "We know that you work for Ukraine, stop or we will put a bag over your head," it's impossible to describe this paranoia. No one will understand this feeling, only those who live there.
Artem Kariakin, also known as Skhidny, hails from Ukraine's eastern Luhansk Oblast. His hometown of Kadiivka, formerly Stakhanov, has been under Russian occupation since 2014. He spent 8 years covertly resisting the occupation from within. Just months before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Artem managed to escape from the occupied territory. Now he is serving in the Ukrainian military. The video was originally recorded in Ukrainian and Russian languages, and then dubbed into English using AI.
Your hometown was occupied in 2014, when you were only 16 years old. Could you tell us about your experience of the occupation?
Occupation is quite an abstract concept for my city. We've basically always had Russian flags alongside Ukrainian ones in the same places, including in public transport. It always caught my eye, and I never understood why it was that way. We live in Ukraine. Why aren't Ukrainian flags hanging in Russia? That's not the case in the neighboring Rostov Oblast, but it is here. It always caught my eye, but many did not pay any attention to it. It all started in 2013, when the Euromaidan revolution started in Kyiv. In the fall of 2013, we began organizing pro-Ukrainian actions of various kinds, such as writing messages on the walls in support of Euromaidan as everything was beginning to unfold. And, at the same time, our opponents emerged. People who would later be brought to Kyiv for the so-called anti-Maidan. In principle, we already had a confrontation with them in the city. We had a small community of pro-Ukrainian activists, and it all started with us organizing an event in the city center to honor the memory of the Heavenly Hundred. By the end of the spring 2014, 2 of our activists had put up a Ukrainian flag on a hill in the city center, and then our opponents opened fire on them with a pistol and other firearms. Then we realized that this was already moving into a different stage, and we no longer held any public actions after that. By then, we had already begun to go underground.
What was the population of Kadiivka at that time? To understand the scale, how big was the city?
About 75,000.
So, you roughly know which people are local and which are not?
The city is small, everyone knows each other, especially active people who participated on both sides. We knew each other, we knew the pro-Russian activists, and they knew us personally. In fact, we walked along the same streets and there was no violence between us. In July 2014, I realized that no pro-Ukrainian actions could be carried out in the city, because there were already armed militants. Russian military vehicles were already arriving. But I still wanted to express my position somehow, because I read what they said in Ukraine, in the government-controlled area, and the majority said that all the pro-Ukrainian people had already left, and only those who supported Russia remained. I wanted to somehow prove to the rest of Ukraine that this is not so, and somehow express my opinion, my position. I was looking for ways to do this on social media. We could no longer use Kontakte because we understood that it was controlled by the Russian security service. And then, for some reason, I discovered Twitter. And I realized that there were people like me on Twitter, from my city, and they shared the same position as I did. And so Twitter became a kind of underground for us, where we could fight and express our position, thinking that it was safe. At first, I just wrote about what was happening in the city and that Ukrainians were still there. I just talked about some basic everyday problems, like empty shelves in stores. I took photos to show problems with water. Then, for some reason, I thought it would be interesting to write about what was happening from the point of view of combat actions. The neighboring cities in Luhansk Oblast, such as Lysychansk, Rubizhne, Siversko-Donetsk and Popasna, had already been liberated by our forces, and that whole pack of Russians who had been there rushed into our Stakhanov.
Did you expect that your city could also be liberated soon? Did you wait for that?
At that moment, we were all waiting for this, because the battle for neighboring Pervomaisk had already begun. Many of our people were already writing that we could prepare Ukrainian flags and get ready to meet our forces. We expected the day of liberation to come at any moment, because back then, liberation moved quickly. But we had a problem that in our part of Lugansk Oblast, there was a kind of cauldron for the Russians. That is, they had nowhere to retreat. They were clamped from the side of Debaltseve and from the side of Pervomaisk. That is, we were in a semi-encirclement. And I understood that most likely there would be hostilities here, and we would not be liberated that easily. Because one day, after the liberation of Popasna, my father came home and said that everything in the city was full of military equipment and that I shouldn't go out at all. It should be understood that before that, we had literally 40 people with machine guns, and that was it for the whole city. Maybe we didn't even feel the occupation in the sense that we just didn't meet them on the streets. And then, on July 22nd, 2014, if I'm not mistaken, I went all around the city in just one day, and they were literally everywhere. That is, the Russians and the militants were everywhere with their wives, with their families.
What did they look like?
They looked like typical terrorists. If a terrorist had been described to me as a child, they looked exactly like that. In different camouflage, carrying weapons at the ready.
Russia had been preparing them for a long time.
Ordinary residents of Stakhanov, I'm talking about my city. They could not somehow occupy the city or have any influence. As a simple example, in my yard, in my area, in my city, many people knew what I was doing before 2014, what I was doing in 2014. Many people saw how I was putting up stickers with the historic Ukrainian insurgent army flag and was pro-Ukrainian and so on. Many people knew that I was part of the football hooligans, the ultras. At that time, the Ukrainian ultras became the absolute enemies for Russians. But until the Russians intervened, no one touched me there, because the relations between the locals, despite different political views or different languages, were still neighborly and friendly. Therefore, I believe that if Russia had not intervened, if they had not shed the first blood, nothing would have happened. Russia brought violence. This is a very important point. A person from Luhansk would never have pointed a gun at another person from Luhansk. This would not have happened if Russia had not artificially created it. They bound us through violence. Because in my city, the majority of people did not care under which flag to live, as long as there was work. There were very few highly driven people. They were not interested in what the Ukrainian insurgent army was. What was wrong with the Ukrainian language? No one even talked about it. There were Ukrainian flags, the Ukrainian coat of arms. Everyone lived in Ukraine and everything was fine. But when Russia began to bind us through violence, when it began to shed blood, now we have such a picture that in Donbas, unfortunately, every other family has someone killed by a Ukrainian soldier. Because they were mobilized into the Russian army. Plus, a very important aspect. The occupation from 2014 to 2022, Russians created such humanitarian conditions in the occupied territories that people simply had no other choice but to go to war. Because it was the only source of income for the male population. Mines, enterprises, and everything else were shut down. A lot was dismantled and taken for scrap. Men went to the army, to the so-called Second Army Corps, just to earn 15,000 rubles. The salary for ordinary jobs was 2,000 rubles. People were forced to join the army to feed their families because they did not want to leave their homes. Like many residents of small towns, they just did not want to leave their homes. They did not see themselves in another city. So they joined this army. Some of them died, some of them were injured. They went there without hatred toward Ukraine. They just wanted to earn money. But when they saw how their friend was killed by the bullet of a Ukrainian sniper, they naturally developed this hatred. This is the essence of Russia's hybrid war. It did everything to pit Ukrainians against each other, bind us with blood, and capture these cities. Just take our land. Their main task is not to save the lives of people in the occupied territories. Their main task is to completely rid this land of Ukrainians.
There are numerous reports in the media that Russia wants to bring Russians to these territories. Crimea is an example. A lot of Russians live there now. More and more, Russia brings their doctors and other specialists there.
They do not just want to bring them. This is a natural process that has been going on for a long time. Take the example of my 9-story apartment building. By 2021, I suddenly realized that most of the residents in my section were people I didn't know. They had come from cities in Russia. They just go there for career reasons. Teachers, for example, are being brought there in large numbers. And unfortunately, many of them stay there. Likewise, after 2014 and 2015, we had a lot of Russian contract soldiers who stayed because they had started families there. I once went out on the street and realized that I just don't know half of the people.
Did you talk to these Russians? Maybe you heard such conversations in a store or overheard by chance a reason why these people stay and don't go back.
Everyone has their own motives. Some just come because it's warmer here and apricots grow. This is their reason. Others just feel like kings in these territories. In Russia, he was nobody. He didn't realize himself in his own town. He came to our city and he has the highest salary in our city. All the girls look at him because they know that if he is in a military uniform, then he has the highest salary and can buy them an iPhone. And he just stays there and puts down roots. He understands that I am nobody back there, but I am somebody here. And so they gradually capture cities. The Russians who came here as warrant officers have become majors and lieutenant colonels. Why would they leave? They like everything here.
What is currently happening in the Russian-occupied territories is not covered enough in the media. But if you like this video and would like to see more about life under Russian occupation in Ukraine, please consider joining the Kyiv independent community by using the link in the description below. Your support is greatly appreciated.
I would like you to tell us how you felt when you were a partisan there, and how you managed to pass all that time unnoticed, or mostly unnoticed.
I was just lucky. I always say that, firstly, it was the incompetence of local special services and their unwillingness to work on counter-sabotage actions. And secondly, just luck. Because there were a lot of moments when, according to the logic of things, I was supposed to be arrested. There were moments when I was detained in places where I had photographed something for our forces. Just by some miracle, they did a sloppy job of checking my phone and let me go. There were a lot of moments, just dumb luck. Because at any moment when I traveled with a phone and thought that if I deleted everything from my phone, nothing could be restored. At any moment, I could have been detained for a more detailed check, and everything would be restored on the mobile device. It's just that no one gave me specific instructions on how to act. They didn't exist back then. All these instructions were written only from our bitter personal experience. And, unfortunately for many, this experience is sad and many lost their lives. But these instructions were written during those years ahead of the full-scale invasion. People, at the cost of their own lives, wrote these instructions on how partisans should act in the occupied territories. But nonetheless, to this day, there is not a single instruction that would guarantee a person's safety 100%. I couldn't say on a bus that I support Ukraine. Of course I couldn't. In fact, all these years I walked around, looked around, and waited for someone to come after me. It was a constant wait. I lived on the 4th floor. The sound of steps on the staircase always made my heart race. I thought they were coming after me. Of course, there were moments when you started to get used to it and more or less not pay attention. But with any kind of escalation, when someone threatened me, saying, "We know that you work for Ukraine, stop or we will put a bag over your head," it's impossible to describe this paranoia. No one will understand this feeling, only those who lived there.
Did your parents know anything about your position? How did they react to it?
They knew my position, but of course they just told me, "Son, please don't do anything, don't make any pro-Ukrainian stickers." They saw it when I was designing something on my computer. They asked me not to do anything. In 2021, after my mother had died, my father said to me, "Son, those big guys will eat you up, don't do anything." Maybe they guessed that I was doing something more. There were some indicators, like when we were standing on the balcony smoking and there was a big column of Russian equipment. I left the balcony for 2 minutes and came back. He asked, "So, did you inform Ukraine?" I don't know if he was serious or just joking. Perhaps he did not want to believe that I really did this. I don't know. And I will never know because they passed away. Of course, they were worried about me. They understood that I could be killed at any moment. They just couldn't believe that an ordinary person, an ordinary child, could do something like this. For most people who don't know about this, no one can imagine how it works. No one can believe that an ordinary person can help adjust artillery fire, or that an ordinary person can destroy whole divisions of the enemy just by passing along information on a regular basis. I think they just didn't believe it, or they didn't want to believe it. I left after I had nothing left. My mother died in 2020. My father died in 2021. I understood that I could leave, but I didn't see a reason to. Then it was actually my friend who served in Azov who saved me. He called me and told me that I had to leave. I said, I'm not in the mood to look for a place to live or anything right now. I don't feel like doing anything. In a couple of days, he found a room for me in Kyiv, organized everything, and told me that I had to leave, either now or never. If he hadn't helped me, I would have waited until winter. I thought that I would maybe leave in the spring of 2022. If so, I would most likely have been mobilized into the Russian army. I would have died as an occupier somewhere near Popasna city, and no one would ever have known this story. I left on December 6th, 2021, completely confused about what to do next and how to live. The only thing that pulled me through mentally was the realization that forced mobilization into the Russian army had started in the occupied territories.
Скажіть, що саме змінилося після 22-го року, коли Росія...
What exactly changed after 2022 when Russia occupied more territories, including parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts that had not been previously occupied? Also more parts in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. What exactly changed apart from the fact that they occupied more territories? Have the repressions increased? Why is it more dangerous now to show any resistance?
чинити будь-який опір в окупації?
The main problem is that Russians began a complete replacement of all law enforcement agencies in the occupied territories, swapping local collaborators for qualified employees from the Russian Federation. They increased the staff of special services and increased control because they realized that there are still a lot of pro-Ukrainian people there. Seeing how their territories are getting under attack and realizing that someone is giving them real-time intelligence all the time, they increased the control over the entire population. It became the norm for many settlements, small towns and villages. They started to surround these settlements once every 3 months and hold so-called filtration activities. Filtration activities started in educational institutions, with mobile devices being checked on a regular basis. That means that once every 3 or 4 months, members of the investigative committee of the Russian Federation or the Russian Security Service come with special software and check all devices of the youth for extremist materials. They are actually looking for informers for the Ukrainian forces or just some Ukrainian elements, as they call them.
There is a well-known organization in Ukraine called the Yellow Stripe, which publishes photos made by locals under occupation. How do you see the effectiveness of such a movement?
I have repeatedly said that I am extremely negative toward this movement and similar movements. I think it is not only irrational. Without changing any tactics, such actions only bring death or arrest to the last Ukrainians who stay there. Our law enforcement agencies are also affected by this. Those people who could be anonymously passing intelligence to destroy the Russians on a huge industrial scale are put in prison simply because they took a photo of a piece of paper against the background of the occupied city.
Is it easy for Russians and the locals to figure out who took the photo?
Now it is very easy. First of all, the photo is taken on a smartphone, and the smartphone gives away everything. The SIM cards are tracked, and the security cameras tell you when it could have happened. Any open source intelligence gathering professional, and there are a lot of them in the main directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation and the Security Service, can determine the time of the photo, the location, and the cameras will track who did it. I have seen a photo taken with a helmet and a Ukrainian flag in the center of Donetsk. Do you think many people paid attention to a person who carried a helmet and took a photo in the center of Donetsk with a Ukrainian flag? Not to mention that every step is monitored by security cameras. As soon as a fresh portion of such photos comes out, everyone should understand, every media outlet that covers this, should understand that these people in the photo are already in prison or will be arrested soon, or killed. But about the movements. In the occupied territories, there can be no coordinated movements, no communities, and especially no activists. This is simply impossible. You can't coordinate people there. There are no groups. It just doesn't exist. If someone says that there is some coordinated resistance movement, it doesn't exist. And you can't do it because it puts people at risk. You can't unite them into groups. All that really exists there are loners who act alone, give information, and carry out sabotage actions. But these are all people who go choose self-sacrifice. They don't join any organizations. Often, they are not recorded anywhere. These are just people who choose self-sacrifice for Ukraine. Moreover, given what countermeasures are being carried out by the Russians, how they work there, how their special services work, it's impossible to act as a group there. And now, in general, it's very difficult to act there. I have already said in other interviews that now, when Ukrainians from the occupied territories ask me how to help, I say, just stay alive, save your life. And then you will meet us with the Ukrainian flag. It will be the best help you can give. If a person is ready for self-sacrifice, understands all the risks, as I understood them at a certain point, then the best form of any partisan actions is the transfer of intelligence. No more. I am not a supporter of sabotage in terms of setting fire to conscription offices or blowing up cars, because this is a one-time action. After that, the person either has to leave the territory or will be detained. Unfortunately, there is no other way.
In conclusion, I would like to quote one of your tweets. You're now a serviceman, and you already mentioned during our interview that you were in Kursk Oblast, and that you found out about it a few hours before you had to leave. You said that invading Russian territory was a moral satisfaction for you, that this was a clear and just response that you could only dream about. To enter the territory of Russia with arms in your hands, trample their land as they trampled ours, to change the flags as they changed ours, to take the territory. Can you describe how you felt in more detail?
First of all, we entered Sudzha. It is necessary to understand that this is the kind of territory where you could get full moral satisfaction for the occupation of one's city, because the majority of the population there are members of Russian law enforcement agencies. This is a border city, and most of the houses and locals are employees of the border service of the FSB. Therefore, for me, it was an absolute act of revenge, because the FSB officers searched my house in Stakhanov on the 3rd of March in 2023. In August to September 2024, I conducted searches in their houses in Sudzha. Therefore, this is a double act of moral satisfaction. It's just a unique operation, and hardly anyone from any other army of the world will ever be able to enter Russian territory. Unfortunately, for many, it seems unrealistic. Because it is a nuclear-armed state, the range of emotions is very large, because we have destroyed a lot of the Russians' red lines and the frameworks into which they themselves put the whole world, saying that Russia is inviolable, they are invincible, this is a strong state. We went there and saw how Russians just ran away, leaving their houses, leaving their civilians. They showed that they did not go to save the people of Donbas because they do not care about their own citizens. I was a little afraid. I did not want to be like the Russians who entered my city. But I could not predict how I would behave with the locals. Of course, there was no talk of violence, but I honestly did not even want to be rude to them. But when we went there, when we began to communicate with the locals, I realized that we would never be occupiers.
Why? What was different about your behavior?
I saw such a contrast between the motives of the Russian occupation of my city and our so-called occupation. These are completely different things. Ukrainians behaved completely differently with the Russians. They tried with all their body and soul to show the Russians that we are good. We are not fascists. We came there to prove that we are not Nazis. Your authorities are lying. We said, here is milk, bread, sausage, meat, medicine. We will bring you to Sumy in Ukraine. You will live, everything will be fine. We are not Nazis. Everyone I saw there from our armed forces tried to tell them why we were there. They said, we are not here forever. We do not need this territory. Just give us our territory. Your government is lying. When the Russians came to us, they said completely opposite things. They said, we are here forever. This is our land. We took it. Ukrainians should not be here. We told the Russians that this is your land. We will not be here forever. We were forced to come here. These are just completely opposite actions, nothing more than a zone of hostilities on the map. But for me, it was still satisfying because the Russians brought a lot of negativity into my life. In fact, they destroyed my life. It will never be the same. I will watch my back until the end of my life. My children will watch their backs. I will worry if they go to school, if I ever have them at all. The fact that they can take revenge on me at any time, at any point in the world, is clear. I am on the international wanted list, and it is not clear what will happen with that in the future. For me, it was morally important to enter their land with a gun in my hands and pay back for the actions that they did. But I could not do it in full, because I did not take anyone to a basement to torture. Yes, I tore off their flags. We showed that it was possible to create a quasi-state there too. A lot of things were done in terms of psychological operations. We even printed out leaflets of the Kursk Republic and handed them to the locals. We said the referendum was yesterday and that they were in the same situation as occupied Ukrainian territories. Then we said, of course, that this was all a joke.
Яким ви бачите
What do you see as the future for the occupied territories of Ukraine? What would you like it to be?
Well, of course, I would like to see it with Ukrainian flags, but unfortunately, we cannot imagine it in the near future. But we do not know how events will turn out. There have been different precedents in history, and we can only hope for future liberation. But for myself, I understand that I will not be able to live in my city anymore, because the Russians did their best to ensure that I could never live there, even with Ukrainian flags on this territory. I realized for myself that the only thing left for me is an act of justice, to go there and return my city to my country.